I think my understanding of 1981 riots, simply because I wasn't born at the time, largely comes from working with the collection at the Black Cultural Archives. I previously used to work at the Black Cultural Archives, and that was a collection that I was developing at the time. So I worked in the oral histories, and I've worked around the riots that happened in 1981. And I think from that, the fundamental theme that came out of that was policing, particularly racism in policing. If I'm going to cut slightly to 2011, I worked for The Guardian, and we did a piece of research with the London School of Economics into the riots across across the entire nation. And we looked, I didn't say we looked specifically at Brixton, but we did speak to people from the area who participated in that. And I think that was more varied. There was themes about policing, but there was themes about general inequality or perceptions of inequality and injustice that existed between the state, your elites, politicians, big business, and your ordinary person, your ordinary young person. And feeling that, there was an anger that caught fire previously in Tottenham, and so it almost felt like there was some kind of, some kind of wave that people felt, well, let's go and express ourselves too. Let's go continue what we saw happen in Tottenham. And there was a sense that people felt that they could basically feel empowered to go out into the streets, and depending on your perspective of how you feel power should be executed, whether destroying your own community constitutes real empowerment is another thing. But from the people that we spoke to in the interviews that were conducted, people feeling, first of all, disempowered by the status quo, felt that time brought the opportunity to actually go out and feel empowered and basically take their own back against the state and everybody who that embodied. I think in Tottenham it was huge. It was the reason why people basically went out into the streets. Mark Duggan's death was what was a catalyst. The march on Tottenham police station, there have been many marches on Tottenham police stations over the past 30, 40 years. And so without that murder, you don't have the anger that led to the protests, that led to people erupting into violence. And I think it's interesting is that from the research that was done, Mark Duggan's name does come up over and over again. Some people say it wasn't a factor for me for why I participated. But others said, well, you know what, Mark Duggan embodies the state having impunity to kill at will and to over-police at will without any sense of retribution. And so I think it was a significant story, but I think, it was far broader than Mark Duggan. What was the role of young people during the riots? I think the danger of focusing on young people in the riots is that you isolated just the young people. Of course, we know that there was a broad spectrum of people involved. And furthermore, I think a lot of the people who did get involved, I think that they were from communities who've had specific issues with the police, which means that if you focus on youth, you miss the connection with the elders. So many people who were out on the streets, their family were out on the streets in 1980. I remember one specific case in Liverpool where people said, my mum told me about being a part of Toxteth riots. I wanted to be a part of these riots. My family have been heralded by the police continually. I remember one of the first people to be arrested in Tottenham, his mother was a very famous case of police brutality. And so there is actually a community link there. And if you focus just on the youth, you might miss that. Of course, young people were disproportionately involved. And a large part of the feedback that I've heard is largely due to the fact that many of the people involved felt over-policed. And of course, I think personally, my opinion is that young people are in an interesting space where in this current climate, I don't think you've seen greater assaults on what young people have, opportunities, employment. And I feel that in amongst being, young and not really having maybe particular responsibilities, people felt that, we're angry and we can express ourselves because we've got nothing else to lose. But I guess that's a good question for somebody younger than myself, maybe such as yourself. I feel that, my perspective is that reading the riots kind of filled a deficit. There was no real public inquiry. What we got was a victims and communities panel, it wasn't a public inquiry, like a Scarman or like a McPherson report, an independent judge-led inquiry, which is something that is pretty thorough. It was really quite a token gesture. And so it was the sense that there is no real inquiry, investigation looking at the social issues that caused or were a part of causing the riots. And so reading the riots, which was quite an interesting project between university and the newspaper, and is something that you don't usually see. They have very different cultures, very different ambitions, was something that tried to occupy that space to say, well, you know what? No one's really asking what's happening. No one's really going to dig beyond the surface of the sound bites and the mania. And so let's do that. But they're different perspectives. There's a data journalist at The Guardian called James Ball, who, as the story now goes, he said, wouldn't it be brilliant if we could do like an investigation into it? And then I believe he said this to one of the deputy editors there, Ian Katz, about it, and they kind of put the idea around loosely as a joke. Everybody knows The Guardian doesn't have any money, so to do such a project, and also to do it, you'd kind of need the backing of a university. So then there were some ideas bounced back and forth, and then the special projects editor who would lead in something like that got involved, and then they put together a rough plan. They approached the LSE, they said yes, and then they made it happen. So I think, depending on who you speak to at The Guardian, somebody might say, well, actually, it wasn't James Ball, it was actually Paul Lewis's idea, because he was the journalist who was reporting from the front line of Tottenham via Twitter and gained like something like 40,000 followers on Twitter through it. So I think that's one for urban legend. I think everybody's always looking for somebody to blame, regardless of what happens. I think it's a dangerous perspective, always looking to blame. It's better to look for an explanation rather than to look for somebody to blame per se. And with something like the riot, which there was such a broad number of causes, generic causes, from your unemployment, from your police brutality, from your police injustice, from the fact that there's grave inequalities, which are obviously mass generic themes, to your more, I would say, personalized issues. The fact that, depending on who you spoke to, everybody might have a different reason for being out there. I think life can be very hard. And I think at times people can feel isolated. And when you see a wave where you get to almost feel empowered and get a crazy rush or a buzz from being a part of such a move, that might fuel you. And so now you're talking about alienation. You might even go deeper into it and find out that particular people, had very, 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 I would say, personal issues. And so looking for one specific issue to blame, I think we miss so many things. I think what we can do, though, is we can say, well, let's look at the things that were consistent. And I definitely believe that inequality is something that is huge. I definitely think that police impunity is something that is huge across the board. And I think these are some of the areas that I would look at and say, well, hang on, why is it that our state, or certainly the way that certain communities and certain people relate to the state, why has it led them to feel like the only way that they can make a protest or make a stand or even feel a sense of power is by taking to the streets in violence? Because that says that perhaps our politics is broken. If I knew what could be done to prevent riots from happening, I might be a rich man. But looking at it solely from what I've researched, if I'm going to just take a very simplistic view of it and not so much engage with the inequality aspect, which was huge, and not so much engage with the backlash against the elites, and I'm talking about expenses, I'm talking about, the bankers, which got a lot of people very irate, the fact that they were treated differently. And they mentioned that in research. If I say, well, actually, looking back at what happened, a man was shot there by the police. It was leaked that he fired at the police first. Nobody believed it. The family didn't have any communication with the police, so they then marched upon the station, and those channels weren't open. I would say, well, clearly, if there were clear channels where the police actually engaged with the family, there would have been no march. And if there's no march, there's no protest in Tottenham, there's no riot in Tottenham, there's no riot in Tottenham, there's no wave. And then you could also say, well, if people actually had trust in the police, they wouldn't need to protest in that manner for answers, because they trust them, they'll trust the processes. If they trusted that actually the police do not get away with shooting somebody, or they cannot get away with over policing or acts of racism, as we've seen in The Guardian. If people felt that the systems were actually trustworthy and that they worked, perhaps people wouldn't take to the streets in the way that they did. And so I think I'd say, if I had to, I'd say that if people trusted the state to be fair and to be just, you're less likely to see riots. I had various different experiences. I have experiences researching the riots and writing about the riots, which of course very different. I had experiences working with, local councils to create post-riot strategies. Actually, my experience of the actual day, I was in Tottenham. Well, I was in Tottenham the afternoon before the riots kicked off. I knew there was going to be a protest. I planned to attend it, but I was told that it was going to be cancelled because of the expectation of violence. So then I came to South London, to Peckham, and then I got a text like, it's about to kick off. So I went back up to Tottenham, and it was, because I'd done so much work researching riots prior with the Black Cultural Archives and understanding the collection of the 80s, it was like, for me, stepping back in time. And it was like, okay, wow. I never thought I'd see this, not in my life. So it was like a lot of those images that I'd been through, it was like seeing that coming to fruition. So when I was younger, I had like twists and people thought they were like dreads or locks. And I remember the first time I ever got my hair cut, it was quite a big thing because I'd always had like dreads or twists my whole life. And the first barbershop I ever went to, that actually got burned down. And so I'm in the middle of, you could say, quite a big zone where it's blazes all around me. I think I might have some pictures actually. And I'm just seeing the shop ablaze. I'm like, wow, it's incredible. And it was a really strange atmosphere, really, really surreal atmosphere, because people never get this. But I'm out, and everybody I've ever known from the area is out. People I haven't seen in years. And people are throwing bottles at police. There was a charge of chariots, and there's a volley of bottles and bricks. Fires being built. People out. So many people out, and it's difficult to differentiate between who's active and who's not active, simply because there's just so many people there, and there was no disharmony. And I said to my friend, "This is strange, yeah, but this is the most peaceful I've ever felt at Tottenham." In the middle of a riot. It was such a surreal kind of environment, to be honest with you. It was quite surreal. And so I think as times evolved, and I've come to even talk about the riots with you now, I think my experience of the riot has somewhat changed, especially because, if you think about the riots as a broader story, my role in that story has somewhat changed. It's interesting because there was a campaign run by a youth group or a youth organisation in Manchester called the Reclaim Project, which aimed to get the media to report positively on young people. And I definitely think there is a case for greater representation, but the truth is that the media report headlines, and headlines are controversial and they're problematic and they're a crisis. That's what people pick up the papers to read. And so in that sense, the news business in itself is one of crisis, which is problematic, as I mentioned before, about, media storms. When there are certain things are reported, it can elongate a situation, in my opinion. And I think we've seen that previously with knife crime. I think 2008 was a really horrific year. And I think that as more media came in, it almost seemed to go up. And as the media disappeared, the crisis didn't disappear entirely, but it was nothing like what it was in 2008, when people were just dying left, right, and centre, not near to where I lived. I think that, really, in terms of getting better coverage and representation of young people, that's got to come from young people themselves. I think in this day and age, with the power of the internet, young people can create their own platforms to put out their own content and their own productions and their own documentaries and their own music. And if you look at, production from, GRM Daily, Graham Daily, SBTV, that's what they're doing. They're saying, well, you know what? We're going to put our own positive content And so I think they're shifting the representation. And so I think the days when, the ITV and BBC ruled representation are coming to an end. Everybody knows the Guardian has no money. Print is dying. Print is actually dying. There are jobs getting shed every single week. And if you go for a drink with a journalist, that's going to turn into a wake. People pouring Hennessy on their careers. The truth is that, the internet offers an opportunity for young people to say, well, you know what, we're going to take back some power and say, well, this is what we're about, this is who we are. You know what, we're different, or there's a nuance to our lives. And so I would say, let's move away from the old establishment media and look at the new social medias and see let's see what opportunities these can offer. This is the thing about the term young people. Young people is a very deceptive term, in that if we go by the definition that most people use of what a young person is, a young person could be anywhere between the age of 13 and 24. Around the riots, what the media frame particularly as youth unemployment is people between the age of 18 and 24, which technically includes myself. But then if we think about young people in Britain, there are so much variation in that group. You've got people who are affluent and are 18. When I was in university, the people who were on my courses, who are extremely affluent, they were young people, but they're not the young people that you hear spoken about as youths in the media. So I think we need to be very specific when we talk about, which young people are we talking about in terms of representation? And I think the representation, of young black males, the representation, of your young northern white males, I think that those representations are absolutely terrible. I think they're framed as violent. I think they're framed as completely unruly. And I think this is the framing of these particular young people points to their over-policing. So, there's a difference between the groups who went to my university, very middle class. When they would go out in the streets, they were not a gang. When they would go out in the streets, they were not being stopped and searched. They were not seen as young people who are problematic. And so I think the term young people in itself describes such a broad range of people and experiences that I don't really feel that maybe the representation between young people really works. We need to be more specific and be more honest and say, well, hang on, who actually is the media misrepresenting? It's not just young people, let's go deeper. It's specific young people, and then why is it misrepresenting them? And that's when you get to the heart of what the real prejudice is. Okay. The spark that caused the riots, without doubt, I think was Mark Duggan's shooting. I don't think Mark Duggan's shooting was isolated. I think in that past year, I'd been on numerous marches where people were actually making cases against deaths in custody. There were so many high-profile deaths in custody. Even if you look back at what happened to Jodie McIntyre when he got pulled out of his wheelchair, and there was a whole movement called Bars for Change that basically wrote and produced music about police violence and police impunity. And then Mark Duggan was shot, and everybody was said that he shot first, and nobody in Tottenham believed it for a second. And then that was the fact that was a spark that led to people basically protesting, and that broke into riots in Tottenham. And I think that most people recognize Mark Duggan's death as being a spark. What I would say was the fuel was the broad other social context, and that was obviously, or the political context, which is, in 2011, there had never been a greater sense of unfairness and a free-for-all. You're seeing the police come under great scrutiny in terms of Leveson and all kind of things that came to the surface. You're seeing expenses claims, you're seeing bangers bonuses. There was a lot of anger against the state, not even just in terms of people that participate, but their communities themselves. And that's something that we found. You're also seeing the fact that, unemployment's rising. There is a sense that things just aren't fair and things are not accessible. And you've got this huge context happening in Britain of crisis. You've got this huge sense that there is crisis happening, and then you've got the anger. And I think those two almost create a perfect storm. Now, if I'm going to talk about the oxygen, which kind of is a way of kind of lack of fuel in a sense, I think the media, and obviously that at work, as media. So that's a bit of a concession in itself. But I think the images that were going around, and the headlines that the police can't do anything, the streets have got the power. The various 24-hour news, I think the various headlines, I think that really led people to go out and see, well, hang on, is this true? And I think media storms are huge. I don't know why. I don't think there is anybody that can really explain the relationship between activity and media coverage. But for me, I do feel that media coverage can inadvertently fuel things happening as well. That isn't to say that you shouldn't cover it. It's just almost like something that happens. And I think what was interesting was that people would say, I saw it on TV, and I couldn't believe what they were saying. So I had to go down and see it for myself, and and so forth. Obviously, there are other things as well. People talk about social media, or not social media so much, more BBM. And I know BBM was a big thing. But for me, I would look at Mark Duggan's death as a spark. I'll consider the sense of crisis maybe as the fuel, and then the oxygen, I think, was media. I don't know if there's any differences. Research will say that they were different. Research will say that there was a clearer narrative in the 1980s. Britain was racist, Britain was unfair, police were violent, people backlashed against it. And they will say 2011 was far more convoluted, it was far more diverse, it was more complex, they'll say. I think some of the root issues very much were prevalent in 2011, and also I'm someone who draws a lineage between the two, and I say, well, hang on, what we see is it's the same communities from 1980s who are again involved in 2011. Like I mentioned previously, one of the first people to be arrested in Tottenham, his mother died in a famous case of police brutality. These are people who had a very long experience of the police, if not them personally, but certainly their families. So that history is very relevant. People say, again, 2011, there was far more violence and less protests. So there was more looting in that sense. But then people forget, Brixton, there was crazy looting happening in Brixton. Somebody I know who was involved said to me, I remember being chased by the police, and in one hand I had a little portable TV, and in another hand I had a stereo. And I'd been chased by the police, and it really hurt me, but I had to let one of them go, and I didn't know which one to let go. So I had to let go of the television because I love music, and then I got away. And they were telling me about the opportunism in the leather jacket stores and things like that. And so I know that looting was a part of the 1980 riots. I know that for a fact. But of course, the way that history is then retold, it's told in a way to take away the politics. So that was real, this isn't real. That way you don't have to deal with the issues. But in terms of giving you a conclusive answer as to what were the fundamental differences, I think more research needs to be done in that sense.